Hello and good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to our event today, the AI Standards Hub webinar on Towards Transparent and Explainable AI, the current standardization landscape. It's a great pleasure to see so many of you have decided to join us. My name is Florian Ostmann. I'm the head of AI governance and regulatory innovation at the Alan Turing Institute, and I'm delighted to be able to kick off this event today. It's the first event within the AI Standards Hub's work program on trustworthy AI. And within that, it's the first event in a sequence of events dedicated to the particular topics of transparency and explainability. I'll tell you a bit more about what that sequence looks like and what we have planned following the webinar. But first of all, for those of you who may not know much about the AI Standards Hub, the AI Standards Hub is a new initiative launched in October this year, dedicated to AI standardization and dedicated to advancing responsible AI by unlocking the role that standards can play as a governance tool and as an enabler of an AI innovation. There's a particular focus within the AI Standards Hub mission on empowering stakeholders to become more actively involved in the international AI standardization landscape, including to become more actively involved in the development of standards and in the informed use of published standards. And the event that we've organized for today, in a way, is very closely linked to this particular focus on stakeholder empowerment. We hope that today's event will provide an opportunity to get an insight into what the current standardization landscape looks like, including standards that are still under development, on the topics of transparency and explainability. And we hope that this event will be helpful for those of you interested in the space to more actively engage with AI standardization on those topics. As part of the AI Standards Hub, we developed a new online platform that launched in October. Many of you will have seen this platform already. For those of you who haven't come across it, I'd like to invite you to take a look. There are lots of resources on there, a standards database, policy database. We've got online discussion forums and e-learning materials. So if you're interested, please accept our invitations to explore the online platform. It's also a great way to connect with other community members through the user account you're able to set up. You'll be able to see which standards other users are involved in, be able to connect with them, and so on and so forth. But importantly, the AI Standards Hub goes far beyond the online platform. And the event today is an example of the kinds of activities that we plan to pursue going forward beyond what we've got in our online offerings. And those activities stretch across community building, collaborative efforts, knowledge sharing and training, and research and analysis. Very briefly, let me give you an overview of our agenda for today's event. I will start by giving you a very brief introduction to the motivation for this event, the context for organizing it. And it will then be a pleasure to welcome our distinguished speakers for today's event, who will give us sort of a first-hand account and insight into relevant standards in this thematic area. We will start with a short presentation from colleagues from the Central Digital and Data Office within the UK government and the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation on the UK government's algorithmic transparency standard. We'll then have an opportunity to hear from Alan Winfield on the IEEE standard 7001 on transparency of autonomous systems. That is an example of a standard on the topic of transparency that has already been published. And we will then move on to hear about ongoing standards development work, particularly work that's happening within ISO IEC. We will hear from the working group convener for the standards at issue to give us a general overview of the work that's happening in that working group. And we'll then hear about two specific standards in this thematic area that are currently under development. That's the approved work item 12,792 on transparency, and 6,254 on explainability. So that will be the set of presentations, and we'll make sure to set aside a significant amount of time towards the end for Q&A, so questions from all of you in the audience. We'd like to encourage you to use the Q&A functions throughout the event, throughout the presentations, to submit any questions that you may have for our speakers, and we will come back to all of those questions towards the end. Now, very briefly, let me just provide a bit of context for this event and how the presentations we will be hearing today fit in with the broader AI standardization landscape. First of all, how do the standards development organizations that we will be hearing from today or about today fit in within the broader AI standardization landscape? As many of you know, but not everyone may be aware, the standards development landscape can be divided or structured according to standards development organizations that operate at the national level, others that operate at the regional level, such as the European level, for example, and then organizations that operate at the international or global level. There are many of those organizations at each level, including at the international level. But today we will hear about the work in two international SDOs that are particularly prominent in the AI space, in the sense that they sort of stand out for pursuing a significant amount of work on AI already. The first one is the Joint Technical Committee between ISO and IEC, and the second one is IEEE Standards Association. I'm sure each of our speakers will sort of give us a bit more background on each of those organizations and how their work fits in the broader agenda of each organization. But that is just a brief overview of where these organizations fit within the broader landscape. Now, secondly, a few brief words on why we decided to choose this topic and why we decided to dedicate a whole program of work to transparency and explainability. There are a couple of points worth highlighting here and feeding into our motivation. First of all, the really salient importance of transparency and explainability within the broader field of trustworthy AI. There are two aspects to the importance of transparency and explainability. First of all, those characteristics are intrinsically important in the sense that in many contexts, it's important in its own right for systems to be transparent and for users, individuals affected by AI systems and other parties to receive explanations about how systems used, when systems are being deployed, and so on. So that's the intrinsic performance, but there's also the instrumental importance. We know that in order to achieve other trustworthiness characteristics, such as safety, bias, absence, reliability, and so on, both transparency and explainability are often important preconditions to achieve those objectives. So whatever the intrinsic importance is, in addition, there is this important aspect of the instrumental importance. The topic is important. At the same time, it's a very complex topic. So when it comes to thinking about what transparency and explainability means, there are a variety of relevant types of information that are at issue. There are a variety of relevant purposes of what transparency and explainability might serve, the sort of the concerns at play. And finally, there are a variety of relevant audiences to whom transparency information or explanations might be provided. And so those three dimensions of variety sort of really give rise to a fairly complex set of questions about what transparency and explainability mean in different contexts, and why this is an important area of work with a lot of open questions currently. As a result of the complexity, there is a shared, a lack of shared terminology that we often see in the research space and the development space, and a lack of internationally agreed best practice. And that's, of course, where international standards come in. They can play a key role in achieving a shared terminology and agreeing on best practice internationally. And that's one of the key reasons for the AI Standards Hub to have decided to focus on this topic, among others. There has been important work at the national level within the UK on these topics that we wanted to briefly highlight. One of those is the algorithmic transparency standard that we'll hear about in a moment. Another important example is the guidance on explaining decisions made with AI that has been co-developed between the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK and the Alan Turing Institute. And one of the objectives of the AI Standards Hub is to bring together conversations that are happening in the standardization world and in the broader world of best practice development. So, for example, the ICO Turing Institute guidance is an example of a very important piece of work that has had significant impact, but that has been so far separate from discussions happening in ISO, IEC, or IEEE. And so part of what we try to achieve with these kinds of events is to bring these conversations together. One thing I'd want to briefly highlight, and some of you may have read about this already in the event announcement, is what we're planning after the event in this thematic area. Importantly, on the 11th of January, we are planning to host an in-person workshop that will be dedicated specifically to the two standards under development that we'll be hearing about today, the two ISO IEC standards. That workshop will be quite a unique opportunity for anyone interested in the topic to feed into the development of those standards at an early stage and to share your expertise and views on key areas covered by those standards. More information on that workshop will be available online. We'll also share the link to that in the chat. Places will be limited due to the interactive nature, but we hope that a lot of you will take a moment, if you're interested, to complete a short application form, and we will let you know, we'll get back to you before Christmas with information about whether we're able to offer you a spot in the workshop and also share additional preparatory materials in advance of the workshop. Anyone who won't be able to join the workshop, there'll be lots of other ways to continue the conversation, including in our online discussion forum. So we very much hope that all of you who are interested in the topic will continue to engage with the AI Standards Hub work in this space. I also would like to briefly mention that our work on transparency and explainability forms part of the broader program on trustworthy AI. And as many of you may have seen on our website already, that work program includes two other focus areas. One is safety, security, resilience. The other one is uncertainty quantification. And so in the new year, you will see a set of activities and events dedicated to these two other thematic areas. And if you're interested in those areas, please watch out for the event announcements on those topics. Now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Elena to the stage to give us her overview of the UK government's algorithmic transparency standard. Elena Hess-Reingans is heading the data ethics and algorithmic transparency work at the Central Digital and Data Office in the government. And in particular, she has led the piloting and development of the algorithmic transparency standard that we'll hear about today. Elena, over to you.
Sorry, just trying to request the remote control. Perfect, thank you very much. Hi, everyone. I'm Elena, and I will talk today about the UK's algorithmic transparency standard, which has now recently been recoined the algorithmic transparency recording standard. And the standard is a joint project with the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation. And I'm also joined by my colleague Liz Adams today, who is the head of the algorithmic transparency program at the CDI. So moving on, is this working? Yeah, sorry. So to give you a bit of background on the standard. So the standard was developed to help public sector bodies in the UK share information on their use of algorithmic tools with the general public. Initially, the standard grew out of an increasing awareness that we need to be more transparent about the use of algorithmic tools that are becoming more commonly employed in government decision-making. And in light of recent examples of poor uses of some algorithms, such as in the A-level case, there have been numerous calls by various civil society organizations to develop such transparency mechanisms. The standard was then developed in response to a set of commitments that we made in the National Data Strategy and the National AI Strategy to develop a cross-government standard for algorithmic transparency. We developed the standard by proactively engaging with a range of stakeholders, including cross-government colleagues, external academics, and civil society experts. We also conducted a deliberative public engagement study with members of the public to feed into the development of the standard. In essence, the standard provides a template for transparency reports for teams to follow, and the completed reports will then be uploaded on a gov.uk landing page to make this information open, understandable, and freely available to the general public. And in terms of timeline, the standard was first published in November 2021, and the most recent copy of the standard is freely available on GitHub currently, alongside guidance to support organizations using it. And since its first publication last year, we have piloted the standard with more than 10 teams across the public sector. So what tools does the standard apply to? So we think that it should be used on algorithmic tools that have a significant influence on a given decision-making process with a significant public effect. It should also be used on tools that directly interact with the public. And to get a better idea of what we mean, here are some examples. So an algorithmic tool can, for example, be a tool that incorporates techniques such as complex statistical analysis or data analytics or forms of machine learning. As a rule of thumb, we think that the more complex the techniques in use are, the more important algorithmic transparency becomes. But more importantly, we want to focus on the influence a tool has. And with influence on decision-making, we mean tools that either replace, supplement, or assist decision-making. And with significant public effect, we mean tools that materially affect individuals, organizations, groups, or populations, tools that have legal, economic, or similar impacts, tools that affect procedural or substantive rights, or those that affect the eligibility, receipt, or denial of a program. And it is worth noting that the standard is currently a voluntary piece of policy where public sector teams can decide whether they want to complete and publish a transparency report for a given tool. So this outline on scope can be seen as a recommendation. So what does the standard look like? We've split it into two tiers, and the split was something that came directly out of a recommendation during the public engagement study, which was conducted by the CDI and Britain Things to make this information more easily digestible for members of the public. So tier 1 contains a very high-level overview, which is geared towards the general public. It describes in an easily accessible and understandable way how an algorithmic tool functions and why it was introduced, along with contact details for more information. Tier 2 goes into more detail, but should still be written in an accessible way. And it collects information on a number of different categories, including owner and responsibility, a more detailed description of the tool and the rationale for using it, information on the wider decision-making process, information on technical specification and data, and then lastly, information on risks, mitigations, and impacts assessments. And here you can also see more or less the link for the GitHub repository where you can have a look at the standard yourself. So tier 1 is pretty straightforward. I mostly covered it. So let's move on to the next slide. So here we have owner and responsibility. And to just give you a very quick overview, the focus of the section is to provide information about who has ownership and responsibility for the tool and whether external suppliers were involved in the development or deployment of the tool. And if so, details on the role of the suppliers as well as the type of contractual relationship in place. The next section is on the description of the tool and rationale for using it. So here teams have the option to include a detailed description of the tool with more granular and detailed explanation. In essence, they can tell a coherent story of how the tool works within its context. And it also includes more information around the scope, expected benefits, the previous process that the tool is replacing, and any alternative methods that were considered. Then we have a section on the decision-making process, and this section covers information on the wider decision-making process and the context into which the tool is integrated, such as the type of output the tool gives to a human decision maker, how that output influences the decision, and what decisions humans take in the overall process. It also provides information on the training that human officers have to complete, as well as the mechanisms that are in place for review or appeal of a decision. Then we have a section on the technical specification and data. And firstly, the section focuses on the technical aspects of the tool, such as the type of model, system architecture, its usage, the phase it's in, information on the maintenance, and how its performance is being measured. And then the second bit of it is the section on data, which includes information on both the data a tool might have been trained on and the data it is being deployed on. And it covers an overview of the data, including a summary of the main variables used, information on the data collection process, the data cleaning, as well as information on the conditions under which the data is being stored and shared more widely. And lastly, we have a section on risks, mitigations, and impact assessment. So the section covers information on any kind of impact assessments that have been conducted to date, for example, DPIAs, equality impact assessments, or any other algorithmic impact assessments, and also asks teams to highlight any relevant risks they may think of for this tool and how these risks have been mitigated against. And sorry, this was really, really quick. If you want to have a look at the slides later, please do. We also have a fictional example on the side to give people an idea of how a transparency report should be filled out. Currently, we also have already 6 reports openly published on gov.uk if people are interested in those. And I'll hand over quickly to Liz.
Thanks, Eleanor. Very briefly, as I know we're short on time, building out of the work we've done with the CDDO on the algorithmic transparency standard, the CDEI has also initiated a program of work around algorithmic transparency, and that includes looking into private sector applications and where that might be appropriate and beneficial. So really keen to hear about the other standards in development today, but also open to engage with anyone who would be interested in learning more about the standard, either in its public sector application or more broadly. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Elena and Liz, for this really interesting overview. I can see there have already been questions coming in through the chat and the Q&A. We'll keep those for the end. We'll come back to questions for all the speakers at the end of the session. But thank you very much for now. I'd like now to hand over to Alan Winfield, who is Professor of Robot Ethics within the Bristol Robotics Lab at the University of the West of England, Bristol. He's also a visiting professor at the University of York and an associate fellow at the University of Cambridge. And a lot of his work focuses on the development of new standards. And as part of that, Alan acted as the chair for the IEEE working group that developed IEEE 7001, the standard that Alan will tell us about now. Alan, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Florian. I'm delighted to be speaking with you. I'm just getting control of the screen now. And to introduce IEEE 7001, which took up about a good chunk of 6 years of my life, I think. So, so yes, let me tell you about it. Yes, here we go. So the standard emerged from the IEEE's global initiative on the ethics of autonomous and intelligent systems. I think this is probably unique amongst international standards bodies that the IEEE actually launched this global initiative to focus on ethics, and with a very particular focus on advancing autonomous systems for the benefit of humanity. I think that's really important. And there's the link, ethicsinAction.IEEE, if you want to see more about the initiative. It was launched early in 2016. So what have we done in the initiative? Well, the first thing that we published is a document called Ethically Aligned Design. It's a crowdsourced document which covers it covers essentially a comprehensive overview of ethical issues in intelligent and autonomous systems. And it's open access. You can download it. I recommend you have a look at it if you haven't already. But of course, being a standards body, you'd expect that we've been spinning out standards. And so far, these are the standards in development. And in fact, I can now highlight that 6 of them have been published to date. In fact, curiously, the earliest standard, the first one to be published, was 7010, which is a well-being metric standard for essentially how to measure how much your autonomous intelligent system is actually improving well-being, which is important given that that's the, if you like, the headline mission. So I'm going to now dive into 7001 and give you a very brief overview of that standard. So the origin of 7001 is in fact in the general ethical principles that we developed. In fact, I led the effort to design those ethical principles in the document Ethically Aligned Design that I've just referred to. One of those general ethical principles is that the basis of a particular autonomous and intelligent systems decision should always be discoverable. So transparency is written into those set of ethical principles. And working group P7001, the group that I chaired, was initiated as a direct response to this ethical principle. So let me tell you a little bit about the working group. We had around 50 volunteer members over the 5 or 6 years that it took us to write. Very wide range of career stages, from PhD students to retired professionals, mostly academics, but we did have a handful of industry volunteers, a pretty international group, and also quite a diverse group. So we had lawyers and experts, with people with particular expertise in standards drafting, also as part of the working group. A fantastic working group, I have to say. I wouldn't have been able to, I mean, it would be very difficult to write a standard without a really great working group. The process, well, we submitted a proposal to the IEEE Standards Association in December 2016. That's a proposal to actually write a standard. You have to get approval before you can even start writing it. And we met then, the working group met for an hour every month until pretty much the end of 2021. And of course, we had subgroup meetings and homework, quite a lot of homework, especially for the chair and my vice chair, Nell Watson. And we were supported by the IEEE Standards Association in those meetings. The first full draft, draft 1, was submitted to ballot for review in June 2020. And that resulted in around 150 comments, which at the time I thought that was a lot, but I was advised by the IEEE that actually wasn't many, that other standards receive many, many more than that. So we then redrafted the standard, and we went three further drafts were submitted and reballoted, and draft 4, the one that is now published, was approved in December 21 and published in March 2022, so earlier this year. So what is the aim of 7001? Well, it's the stated aim is to set out measurable, testable levels of transparency so that autonomous systems can be objectively assessed and levels of compliance or conformance determined. Importantly, the standard 7001 doesn't specify how to build transparency into systems, only what kinds of transparency required and how to measure them. In fact, after the standard was approved, several people came back to me and said, do you know what, we didn't think it was possible to write a set of measurable testable levels of transparency. It seems, transparency often appears to be a rather vague notion, a property. It's a property of systems, of course, but we were very keen that we wanted our standard 7001 to be a standard to which you can measure conformance, which we have achieved. Who is 7001 for? Well, the intended audience for 7001 are designers, manufacturers, operators, and maintainers of autonomous systems, everybody responsible for an autonomous system. It's also a generic standard, so it's intended to apply to all autonomous systems, including robots, driverless cars, for instance, assisted living robots, drones, robot toys, etc., as well as software AIs. So everything from medical diagnosis AIs through to chatbots, facial recognition systems, and so on. So it really is a very, very broad standard. So how do we define transparency? This is very important. What do we mean by transparency in autonomous and intelligent systems? And we define it broadly as a system is transparent if it's possible to discover why it behaves in a certain way. For instance, why it made a particular decision. But we also define explainability. The standard, in a sense, is a standard on both transparency and explainability. But we define explainability as a subset of transparency. In other words, it's a special kind of transparency. It's transparency that can be expressed in plain language, understandable to non-experts. Now, I grant that, of course, for instance, in explainable AI, that's not how explainability is defined. But of course, the beauty of writing a standard is that we can write our definitions. And we chose to define explainability as transparency to non-experts. And you'll see, I hope you'll see why that's important. Here is the formal definition of transparency in 7001. The transfer of information from an autonomous system or its designers to a stakeholder, and I'll come on to stakeholders, which is honest, contains information relevant to the causes of some action, decision, or behavior, and is presented at a level of abstraction and in a form meaningful to the stakeholder. So that is our formal definition. We spent a lot of time, as you can imagine, working on that definition. Why is transparency important? Well, actually, this has already been covered, I think, by Florian and Eleanor. I mean, there are many reasons it's important. Here are, I think, our top two in the working group. Number one, autonomous systems can and do go wrong. I should explain that I'm an old-fashioned safety critical systems engineer. I spent the first 10 years of my professional life building safety critical systems. So that is, things going wrong is a kind of particular focus for my engineering practice. And of course, without transparency, finding out what went wrong and why is extremely difficult, if not impossible. The second super important reason is about explainability. All autonomous and intelligent systems is designed to work for, with, or alongside humans. And we humans need to be able to understand what they're doing and why. And without that understanding, those systems will not be trusted. I have to say, I don't really like the word trust, but we're stuck with it. The discourse is all around trustworthy systems. Personally, I think we should not trust our systems. I think the best that we can do is to be confident in them. I think our systems should be reliable and we should have good confidence in them. But there we are. So transparency, this is very important. We realized very early in the drafting of 7001 that transparency is not one thing. For instance, the transparency that your elderly mother needs, if she has an assisted living robot, is very different the kind of transparency that the engineer who fixes it needs. So transparency really means something very different to different stakeholders. And this is where we introduced the idea of stakeholders. So we essentially, after a lot of debate, settled on two groups of stakeholders. a group of non-expert stakeholders and a group of expert stakeholders. And the non-expert stakeholders include users, that is, users of the intelligent or autonomous system, and a second group of wider society who also need transparency. If these systems are in the world that we share the world with them, whether there's driverless cars or delivery robots or AIs, which of course are already in the world, all of those, then we need to have some transparency about those, even if we're not directly interacting with them personally. And then we have this group of expert stakeholders. And those we've defined as safety certification engineers or agencies, accident investigators, and the third one, lawyers or expert witnesses. And I'm just going to give you a little taste of the kinds of transparency that we require for each of, not for all five, but for the ones I've underlined. So let's look at users to start with. Well, users need the kind of explainability that builds trust or confidence. And by providing simple ways to understand what the system is doing, why. And here's an example of the kind of explainability that would be really good for instance, an assisted living robot. So the user should be able to say to the robot, why did you just do that? And receive a simple, understandable answer. A rather more sophisticated question would be, robot, what would you do if I fall down? Or what would you do if I forget to take my medicine? And if the robot is able to answer those questions, then the user is able to build a mental model of what the robot is doing and why, and therefore more likely to have confidence that robot is doing what you expect, and therefore building a level of trust, even though I really don't like the word trust in this context. So in fact, after the first, one of the big revisions we made after the first review was to define in rather more detail different kinds of users. So we ended up, the final standard has three kinds of users that we define: non-expert users, the kind of person I've just been referring to, persons who interact either every day or perhaps with only a brief interaction, but are naive users. They're not experts in the technology at all. And then we have a second category of what we call domain expert users. And these are persons who carry some responsibility for how the system is used, or perhaps they're responsible for operating and supervising the system. So they're experts in the domain of application of the system, not necessarily the system itself. And then super users, who are experts not only in autonomous systems, but also in the particular systems for which they're responsible. And you'll see how those manifest in just a second or two. So here is a very simplified table showing transparency levels, which are for all of the five stakeholders are 0 to 5. 0 is no transparency at all. And you can see that we define level 1 as a user manual is provided. Level 2, the manual should be presented as interactive visualization or simulation. And levels 3 and 4, which are really stretch targets, because these are quite difficult to achieve in the current state of the art. So it's interesting, I think, that standards should stretch the state of the art. Standards are not only concerned with systems that exist today, but are being developed and may well be in use within the next 3 or 4 or 5 years. So let me now show you a little fragment of table 1, which is transparency requirements for users from the actual standard. And of course, you won't be able to read this; it's far too small. But I hope you can see that we have the requirement: the user shall be provided with accessible information. This is the naive user, And then we have domain experts and super users shall be provided with user documentation specified and prepared in accordance. So in other words, we're looking for a higher specification for the documentation, and for super users, but not domain expert users, documentation shall additionally detail procedures for system fault diagnosis, repair, maintenance, upgrade, and end-of-life decommissioning. So you can see the kinds of the ways that we're setting out nuanced requirements, normative requirements for the different levels of transparency. And so that's just a little sample. So let's now turn to accident investigators. Well, what do they need? Well, of course, essentially, an accident investigator is typically concerned with what happened, why it happened, and how can we make sure it doesn't happen again? And it's the most important thing is the why. So we need details of the events leading up to the accident and details of also of the internal decision-making processes in the intelligent system. And of course, we have an example of the gold standard, if you like, for accident investigation, of course, is air accident investigation. And one thing we do require in some levels of the standard is what in fact, my research colleague Marina Girotka and I call an ethical black box when we published this paper back in 2017. Very simple idea. We're just arguing that every robot and by extension autonomous system, particularly if it's a critical safety critical system, should be fitted as standard. And in fact, ideally, regulation should demand that they're fitted with the equivalent, the robot or AI equivalent of an aircraft flight data recorder. And indeed, we've built that into the standard 7001. And this is a fragment of the table that sets out the normative requirements. And you can see level 2 says that autonomous systems should be equipped with an event data recorder. That's a generic term for black box, capable of recording a timestamped log of key system inputs and outputs. And there are, there's a little bit more detail on that. Level 3 says an event data recorder designed to meet either a standard or open standard specification. So the difference between levels 2 and 3 is that level 2 can be a proprietary EDR, whereas level 3 must conform to a standard. And then level 4 additionally requires that the reason, that is the reason for the decision, is also logged in the EDR. So I hope you get a sense of the way that these levels typically progress. Not all of them are progressive, but a number of them are progressive to, as it were, more demanding levels of transparency. And then I just want to finish this very brief introduction to the levels of transparency by showing you the table. This is the entire table. It's quite short in the standard for lawyers and, oh, I'm sorry, it went on too fast. For lawyers and expert witnesses. And this is important and I think useful because essentially people who are giving testimony, expert witness for, when things go wrong, perhaps when things reach a tribunal or a court of inquiry or whatever, then the kinds of information that are needed in addition to the evidence from, for instance, an event data recorder or from the safety certification and so on, we think that you also need to know about the quality management processes in the company. So we're asking in level 1 for conformance to ISO 9001 typically or equivalent. Level 2 would require that the designer, manufacturer, operator undertakes a process of ethical risk assessment. This, in fact, reflects a little on what Eleanor was describing in the previous segment. So risk assessment and control mitigation, and again, there are standards, BS 8611, for instance, and ISO 7,000. And then level 3, we're saying that we're expecting the designer or manufacturer to apply an ethical governance framework within its product life cycle. And in level 4, that there is an audit trail for all of the stuff above. You know, with that kind of information, you have transparency about the processes by which the system was designed and operated, risk assessed, and so on, in addition to the transparency afforded by the earlier for the other stakeholders. So that brings me then to the final part of my short presentation. I wanted to share with you that the standard 7001 not only describes the normative requirements that I've described already, I've outlined already for those 5 stakeholder groups, but we also define 2 processes. So this is essentially, so there's an appendix 1 in the standard is how to use it, how to use the standard. So we define 2 processes: system transparency assessment, which is a method for assessing the transparency of an existing system, and system transparency specification. That is a method for specifying the transparency requirements of a system prior to its development. So you do an STS if you haven't built the system yet, and then you do an STA to assess whether in fact it meets, in reality, that requirement, set of requirements. Of course, an STA can be applied to existing systems, as it were, post hoc. So let me just give you an example. In fact, we have an example which was based on a paper that I published with a case study on ethical risk assessment of a robot teddy bear. So we're imagining this robot teddy bear, smart robot teddy bear. This is an example system transparency assessment for RoboTED, and I will, there is a paper, published paper that has this in more detail. So you can see that the assessment for the 5 stakeholder groups, and the assessment is here are the transparency levels that are assessed, the robot is assessed to meet. So 1 and 2, and that's how it's evidenced. The user manual is provided. An interactive online visual guide is also provided for parents and children. That would be level 2. It meets level 1 for the general public, which requires a robot identifies itself as an autonomous system. When powered up, RoboTED announces itself as a robot. And then we meet level 2 of certification agencies, because it's been certified as safe against the standard on safety of electric toys, for instance, and so on. You can see the idea, I hope. It's important also to say, of course, that there is no sense in which a system is poor or weak in transparency if it doesn't meet levels 5 across all 5 stakeholder groups. What is an adequate level of transparency will vary from one system to another. And that's really why you need the system transparency specification, because the system transparency specification really sets the target for transparency for these 5 stakeholders. And the STA then is a tool for helping you to determine whether you're meeting that target. And that, I think, oh yes, we published a paper in July last year, yes, July 2021. So the paper predates the published standard, but the paper does in fact give more detail on the thinking behind the standard and examples worked examples of both system transparency assessment and system transparency specification. So I'm sorry that was rather a fast overview, but I hope it's given you an idea of 7000 and what's in it. And of course, I want to thank the amazing working group, and in particular my co-chair, Nell Watson, and there are some references here as well. So I'm not sure if I have time, Florian, to answer any questions, but I'll stop there. So thank you very much indeed for listening.
Thank you very much, Alan, for this excellent and very rich overview and summary. There were several questions coming in. I think in the interest of time, we'll probably save most of them for the end, but perhaps one question that's mostly clarificatory in nature. That was a question around what types of systems is the standard meant to apply to? And that, I can see where that question might be coming from, given that the standard is framed as a standard for autonomous systems. The event, we framed as an event about AI standards. There's often a question: how do autonomous systems as a space relate to AI? Is a standard, meant to or intended to apply to all kinds of AI? Is it meant to focus primarily on robotic systems? Is it meant to apply to any algorithmic system? How would you draw the lines?
It's essentially, and there is, I should have really included a slide. It's a great question. There is a section of the standard that defines what we mean by autonomous systems, and it's deliberately designed as a generic. It's if you like, an umbrella standard. So AIs are certainly AI systems, whether they're algorithmic or machine learning based, are definitely within scope. Absolutely within scope. Essentially, an autonomous system is any system that makes decisions without or with less than 100% human control. And that includes semi-autonomous systems. So semi-autonomous systems are certainly in scope as well. And what we're hoping, if the standard is successful, and of course you never know, it takes years for a standard to become embedded. But what we're hoping is that others will write substandards, if you like, spin-out standards. You could imagine 7001.1, which would apply to, for instance, medical and healthcare, autonomous systems, medical healthcare domain. 7001.2 might be autonomous vehicles, which would drill down and provide more detail of the particular kinds of transparency needed by particular domains. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. And I'm sure the question of the relationship between horizontal and vertical standards might be something we'll come back to later if we have time in the discussion segment. Thank you. So this was an example of a standard that has already been published. It's the prominent example of an AI autonomous system transparency standard that has already been published. And we'll now move on to hearing about standards that are currently still under development. And for that, I'd like to invite David Phillip to join the screen. David Phillip is the convener of Working Group 3 within Subcommittee 42 within the Joint Technical Committee 1 at ISO-IEC. Now, that is quite a mouthful. So as a brief explanation, I'm sure David will elaborate. ISO and IEC are two important international standards development organizations. When it comes to standards for information technology, there's a joint technical committee between those organizations to work together to develop joint standards. And within that joint technical committee, there's a subcommittee dedicated to AI. And within that subcommittee, among a number of other working groups, there's a working group for trustworthy AI. That's the group that David Phillip is convening. Now, David will give us an overview of that group, the work that's covered in that group more generally, and will then be joined by Rania Wazir and Lauriane Offrand, who will talk in more detail about the two particular standards under development that we'll be looking at today, the transparency and the explainability standards, respectively. David, over to you.
Thank you. I think you explained it very well, I will be covering that a little bit. Like JTC1, it is really the only joint committee between the two oldest standardization organizations, ISO and IEC. Anyways, I have a rather extensive slide deck. I am not going to use it all, but the idea is to provide it as a resource for people in this and other, follow-up workshops that will be more hands-on, because this provides kind of an overview of the program. So that there is a bunch of my roles in standardization and industry. I will start with European setup. Why is this all relevant? Why even UK bothered and created the AI hub? And So there is a lot of eyeballs on AI standardization. You know, it is there is pressure to do regulation, and so I would like to explain the European setup a little bit. Of course, like UK Brexited, but it is still part of the European standardization system, and that's very well. So there is an example. GDPR is an example of very successful regulation. A draft AI Act tries to repeat that that success, and this is why there is now this is why this is now very important, because standardization provides tooling for a regulator to do, to protect their stakeholders, basically. And the European setup is like this. The regional organizations, CEN, CENELEC, and ETSI, they are basically mirroring the international organizations, ISO, IEC, and ITU in their respective areas. I will be kind of ignoring the telecommunications part of it. So CEN and CENELEC mirror the ISO and IEC. And in ISO and IEC, there's this joint committee, that has the 42 committee subcommittee for AI, and CEN-CENELEC. Well, our aim is basically to make sure that CEN-CENELEC, as usual, they take over maximum from the international, maximum possible from the international scene to avoid forking of, technical methods of standardization and regulation. So regulatory demand, who are the players? There are many players, especially in Europe, Council of Europe. This is wider than European Union, as you know. European Commission has a bunch of things, the high-level expert group, JRC, AI Watch. The European Parliament is very important. This is where the AI Act is now. Of course, I would like to give some general framing. So if you do regulation in general should be technology agnostic. So it is somewhat fishy, that we are now talking about specifically regulating AI. That's a type of technology. But overall, legal frameworks apply, and it shouldn't really matter, what did you do? What did you use? What kind of tools did you use to break the law? Yeah, it doesn't matter whether you killing people with an axe or an assault rifle, or if you discriminate, using Excel sheets or neural networks algorithms. It is illegal, all the same, right? And so, sometimes, like the pressure to regulate on AI has somewhat naive expectations, and those expectations are naive in the sense that they expect AI to solve things that haven't been solved, that were problems that were basically depositing for decades or centuries, really real systemic issues, and if you basically you feed an AI system or a machine learning system some data, and then you wonder that it became racist, or, well, of course it did, because this is how the system works, right? So AI cannot solve that on its own. I will say something. I think that I heard a similar note on what Alan said about trustworthiness and trust. My working group is on trustworthiness, not on trust, because trust is psychological or religious, and people trust things for very different reasons. For instance, because Tom Hanks was in their art, like that's not that's not trustworthiness. If we are standardizing trustworthiness, that means objective system properties that make the system worthy of trust. But don't be mistaken, like trustworthiness characteristics, they are objectively in the system, but they are neither necessary nor sufficient condition for people to trust, because people can trust things for good reasons, or they can trust things for wrong reasons, right? So we are strictly about trustworthiness, not trust, because trust is in, minds and so on. So in technical standardization committee, we can only define and describe trustworthiness, not trust. Specific demands, biggest gaps, regulatory landscape, global SDOs. Yeah, well, I kind of touched on that on the European setup. Let's jump on the JTC one. I think that was very nicely covered by Florian. JTC one has currently 23 active subcommittees. The newest is 43 on brain-computer interfaces. The second newest is 42 on AI. 41 is on IoT, for instance. 38 is on cloud, just to give you a taste. Among those committees, some are more important than the others. We call those system integration entities, and I just named a few, 38 on cloud, 41 on IoT and digital twin, 42 on AI, working groups on smart cities, 3D printing and scanning, quantum information technology. And now, of course, the committee on brain-computer interfaces is also a systems integration entity. Some of my JTC1 roles, the systems integration facilitation function in JTC1 explained, and JTC1 wide definition of trustworthiness. This is defined in this TS 5723, published in summer 2022. This is very short. Well, this is SALT, but because it is a vocabulary standard, the preview gives it all to you. It's just vocabulary. So normally, terminology of standards is accessible even if they are SALT. So this standard basically all the terminology, the whole vocabulary standards is available in preview, so you can refer to it. Now 42 in it, as I mentioned, it is a systems integration entity, and that means serves as a focus and proponent for JTC1 standardization program on artificial intelligence. The systems integration entities are responsible to provide basically with the service anyone interested in the whole world of standardization, especially the IEC and ISO ecosystem, but also other organizations developing AI standardization or applications. Some statistics of the SC42 on AI. It has 35 participating members. This is basically the same number of members as the JTC1 parent. It is growing. Like we have currently 15 observing members. The observing members are slowly converting. Those are basically the national bodies, right? That's why it's called international standardization. So the observing members are slowly converting into participating members. So we will probably overtake the parent committee pretty soon. 39 internal liaisons, 13 external liaisons, including IEEE, 6 working groups, hundreds of delegates and experts. And if you have a brief look at the statistics, well, you can see we are contributing towards a bunch of sustainable development goals. If you can see the statistics for under development and published, you can see that in the pre-standardization area, there is more published, and in the normative area, there is more under development. That is quite natural because pre-standardization is before standardization, of course, but it also takes less time. It has less rigorous approval. So of course, like the pre-standardization work is kind of almost done. and the normative work is mostly under construction, I would say. So the 42 has currently 6 working groups. The joint working group on governance of AI was dissolved because they already published their standard, but we, in the meantime, formed a joint working group with SC7 on testing of AI systems. And we have the 5 core groups on foundational that publish the terminology, standards, big data or data, and my group on trustworthiness, other group on applications and computational. So just some of the landscape, some of the most important standards. So the governance standard that was published by the now disbanded group on governance of AI, that was joint work with the SC40 on governance, foundational or framework standards, basically the terminology, and a big deal, the management system standard. This is now under DIS. This is basically fairly close to publication. And now closer look on, you can use this link. I hope the slides will be provided by the organizers. This is a filterable, program of 42, and it will, it is always current. So in my working group, we have 300 plus experts. Yes, we are bigger than the parent committee. 8 active projects, 15 projects in general. We have some very important liaisons like 65A, which is functional safety, JTC7 systems engineering, ETAC, which is labor, European labor organization. 10 active lead editors, and 2 of them are joining us today. This is Rania Wazir and Jeho Lee. And we have also a funnel road mapping activity. And again, you can see this, like we have more published pre-standardization work, and basically all of our normative work is under development, but 3 standards are very, very, very close to publishing. So these slides are overview of all projects in that group. It has links to the stages. If you are not familiar with the stages, it will take you there. 60/60 is for published. That's kind of the mature stage. So those are the TRs that we already published, other TRs that we already published. The bias one, I saw in audience Adam Smith, who is the editor of this one. We also published overview of ethical and societal concerns. Those are still TRs, pre-standardization work. Very nearly published the risk management guidance. This is in FDIS. This will publish very early in 2023. And then we have a very key standard, 25059. This is our extension of the SC7 methodology on Square quality model for engineer systems, right? And this is basically, this provides the delta, what is different for system quality in AI, with AI, So this is a really key standard of the group and the whole 42, and this basically defines of your quality characteristics that are at the same time trustworthiness characteristics, and among them, of course, prominent characteristics such as robustness. So the other nearly done standard is on the assessment of robustness of neural networks, formal methods. But we are slowly getting to what the project that we will look today. We have Jeho Lee, the editor here, and an expert, Loriana Front, who will be covering this standard as the explainability standard, objectives and approaches for explainability of machine learning models and AI systems. The other standard is a companion to the Square standard on evaluating quality. And The other standard that we will look at today is the working draft 12792, and Rania Wazir, the editor, is here. So this is the transparency taxonomy. So again, one of the prominent top-level characteristics of AI trustworthiness. The WDTS 8200 is also fairly important. This is on controllability, but that's not a focus of our webinar today. I would just say it is a prerequisite of oversight in governance sense, and a big deal for the European Act based requests. So with that, I would finish and give it to my editors. As I said, this slide deck will be available as a resource for you, and feel free to connect and ask questions also outside of this webinar. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, David, for this really rich summary. It's a very impressive range of work, of course, and also for offering to make your slides available afterwards. We will do that via our website. So thank you for that. And without further ado, I'd like to invite Rania to come in. Rania is the co-founder and CTO of Livand AI, which is a startup dedicated to supporting companies and organizations with the development and deployment of trustworthy AI. Rania is a mathematician and data scientist focusing on trustworthy AI and NLP and social media monitoring, and she currently acts as the project editor for AWI 12792, which we will hear about more now.
Interrupt you just for a sec. We keep calling them AWI, and even Rania has AWI, but this is an anomaly in the database. They are in working draft. It is far more advanced than AWI. Sorry for that. That's an ISO mess, actually. You know, like it is wrong in the database. It is working draft. And
okay, that's great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. No, thank you very much for pointing that out. And that's, you know, I'm sure it'd be interesting, you know, for a lot of people on the call who are less familiar with standardization to learn about these different acronyms and the different stages, and the resources that you have on your slides about the different stages of development in ISO IC are really useful.
There is full documentation of the cycle, yeah, if you are interested.
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah. No, thank you. Great. Rania, over to you.
Great, thanks a lot. I'm very happy to be here and to be able to talk about our 12792 transparency project with you. So in contrast to the standard we've seen so far, this one is a work in progress, and we are housed, let's say, in working group 3, which focuses on trustworthiness. And you've just heard David, our convener, very nicely explain how the ISO IEC JTC1 structure works. So this project is pretty recent. It started in February of 2022, and it's expected to run for about 3 years. And at the bottom, you can find a link to information about this project. So one difference to all the other standards we've seen so far is that this one is actually not about transparency of AI systems, but is a taxonomy of the transparency of AI systems. And what's the difference here? The difference is that we're not writing a standard telling people what exactly you have to do in order to make your AI system transparent, but we are trying to provide all the language and all the information elements that you might want to include if you decide to be transparent about your AI system. So why do we need this taxonomy? Well, for one thing, we still don't have a common language, and we still don't have a common understanding of the concept of what it means for an AI system to be transparent. So with the taxonomy, this will then serve as a basis for future specific AI system transparency standards, whether specific means application specific. So if you want to talk about transparency in the medical field or in the health field, or if you're talking about regionally specific. So maybe as the AI Act takes shape, we will need to talk about what it means for an AI system to be transparent in the EU, for example. The other advantage, and this should really be highlighted, is it improves communication among different AI stakeholders. And the ability to talk about transparency and know that that the other person is actually referring to the same thing increases trust and accountability. And finally, the taxonomy is intended to provide guidance on what the different transparency elements mean, what their uses are, and also what their limitations are. So before I move on, I just wanted to point out there's a great resource, the ISO online browsing platform, and you can find a lot of definitions and document outlines available there. So the definitions and items that you're about to see on these slides, you could also look them up yourself on this browsing platform. Now, the wonderful thing about working in standards is you're not working alone, and you're standing sort of on the giants of on the shoulders of other standards. And the first thing we need to establish, if we're talking about transparency of AI systems, we need to make sure that we all agree, what do we mean by AI system? So if you look at the year of publication of 22989, it was just published this year. I'm afraid, yes, let's move back to the AI system definition. So this is a definition that was only established this year. But fortunately, we have it. We have agreed that an AI system is an engineered system that generates outputs. And those can be contents, forecasts, recommendations, and they're all derived based on a set of human-defined objectives. We also have decided to look to 22989 for a definition of transparency. And so based on 22989, transparency is a property. Now we actually have two definitions of transparency, and I will show you the second one next. But the first definition looks at transparency as the property of a system. So it's the property of the system to provide appropriate information to relevant stakeholders. And the notes to entries give you examples of what could possibly be meant by appropriate information. So there are things like features, performance, limitations, components. And in some sense, our taxonomy is going to flesh that out much more. However, the second note to entry also points out, and this we will also see in the work on the transparency document, that sometimes transparency, if taken too far, can come into contradiction with other important system characteristics like security or privacy. However, transparency, when we're talking about AI systems, does not necessarily only refer to the system, but it can refer to organization and the communication of activities, decisions, and making available of such communications to the relevant stakeholders. Okay, so having established sort of a common ground, what are we talking about? I want to first take you into the work that we're doing within the project right now. And really, what we are trying to do is place transparency. And the first thing is place transparency in the ecosystem of trustworthiness. How does transparency relate to all of these other trustworthiness characteristics? In some sense, transparency can be sort of a part of trustworthiness. It can also be a part of quality, but in others, you can see that it contributes, maybe helps reproducibility or helps in identifying fairness. And in other cases, transparency can, again, come into conflict with privacy or security. So trying to understand how transparency relates to these other trustworthiness characteristics is a part of the process. Now, if we're trying to talk about the transparency of an AI system, we've recently discovered that it's sort of hard to define where are the boundaries of the AI system. So you cannot think of the AI system as a closed box. It's embedded in a context. This context can be environmental, it can be societal, it can be economic. And the AI system is interacting with all of this context, so that if you're being transparent, you may need to be transparent about the environmental impacts on the system's performance, and at the same time, for example, the AI system's impact on the environment. And the same goes for all of the other sort of embedding contexts. And this is a point of discussion that is going on in the working group right now. If you take this approach too broadly, the danger is that we will, in some sense, never get done, because the context is so broad. However, you don't need to only look at sort of the high level and this very wide view of the AI system when trying to define transparency, but you can break down the AI system and start looking at, well, which part of the AI system am I going to be transparent about? And we have different levels. You can consider transparency at the AI system level. So you're looking at the whole engineered product and considering that as your minimal object and being transparent about that. But you can also break down the AI system and start looking at some of the components. And your components, for sure, you will have models that you will need to be transparent about. And these models, if they are machine learning models, will be based on training data. Again, that will require transparency, but even heuristic systems and expert systems will require at some point input data in order to operate. So you have sort of the AI system as a whole and components that interact in different ways. And the question is, which parts of these interactions are we going to be transparent about? And how are we breaking down this classification? Just as an explanation, the reason you see exactly these three items broken down here is that the current project looks at exactly this breakdown. So we consider the AI system as a whole, and then we consider transparency for the component models, and then we consider transparency for data. However, I pose the question to you. There are other, let's say, elements that could be considered when we're looking at an AI system that one could conceivably also choose to be transparent about. So another thing that we are looking at in the project is that an AI system is not fixed. It goes through different life cycle stages. And as the AI system progresses through these different life cycle stages, there are different elements that it may be necessary to be transparent about. And again, here, when we are looking at life cycle stages, we base our focus on those that are defined in 22989. So you will have an inception phase, a design and development stage, verification and validation, deployment, operation and monitoring, and moving on all the way to the retirement of the AI system. And one of the questions that we're dealing with is, do we want to address transparency elements as they vary through the AI system lifecycle? And as an example, you might want to consider that there are transparency elements you want to make available between the design and development and verification phase that are addressed only from within sort of the developing organization, passing information from the AI developers to the AI testers, and what kinds of information elements would they need. Alternatively, at another level, if we are considering, for example, environmental impacts, we might want to consider environmental impacts of the AI system through its development phase. So what was the energy requirement to train the model? What is the energy requirement to operate and monitor the model? And what is the, let's say, environmental impact of retiring the whole AI system? And also this, we've seen this addressed already in some of the prior presentations. Transparency is also not fixed, but it depends on who is supposed to provide it and whom they are supposed to provide the transparency to. And you can look at this from very many different perspectives, but some examples that are listed here are transparency from the data source, the data provider, and this would be addressed to the AI developer maybe. You might have a transparency from the AI developer, and this needs to go to the AI auditor, or transparency from the AI user, and this needs to be addressed to the AI subject and to the regulator maybe. So these again might require different transparency elements that have to be defined, with the extra layer of complication, and this is nicely addressed in the IEEE 7001. Well, how much transparency goes from particular stakeholders to the others? So I hope I've now given you a very broad overview of the many questions that we are trying to work on within the taxonomy of transparency for AI systems project. And I'm looking forward to more questions and hopefully some answers that come in from this group. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Rania, for this another very rich overview. It's great to see, what are the different questions that you're grappling with as you develop this standard, and it's really interesting to see that environmental sustainability forms part of that, because we know that that's of course an increasingly important topic in the context of responsible AI. I don't see any questions currently specifically related to your presentation, so I suggest, in the interest of time, we'll move on. We'll come back to questions at the end, but anyone out there listening and watching, please do post your questions into the Q&A box and we will come back to them later. So I'd now like to hand over to Lauriane Offrand to present to us about technical specification 6254 on explainability. Lauriane is a PhD in natural language processing, currently working as an AI researcher at INRIA, which is the French National Institute for Research in Digital Science and Technology. And she's playing a key role as an expert in the development of this standard, which we'll hear more about now. Lauriane, over to you.
Thank you, Florian. Yes, so Lauriane Offrand, presenting the Working Group 3 project on explainability. So I'm an expert contributing to this project, but you also have Jeho and David, so the editor and convener in the room, so they will be happy to answer any question as well. So for those who are not really familiar with it, XAI, so explainable AI, is all about answering the why, in the sense that we may have high performance systems or AI systems, and we've had a growing number of those in the recent years, as you probably know. But when applied on practical use cases, this then prompts a lot of questions, in particular from the users, but not only, as per where the answers from the AI system come from and what really happened so that they reached those conclusions. So this is a topic that has been under growing interest for the give or take 5 last years from various communities, from the science point of view, from policymaking. And this all leaves the industry in a delicate situation where they need some guidance on what they should do right now. Should they put XAI in the systems, and how and why, and so on. And this is the reason why Working Group 3 that David has presented earlier has started looking into this topic a bit more than 2 years ago, and decided to start an actual standardization project on it last year. So we are roughly midway in this project. It's a long 3-year project, and we still have a bit more than a year ahead of us with the targets for publication of the technical specification early 2024. And by technical specification, what we mean here is should be a guidance for implementation. So that's one type of standard. So I've been talking about XAI, but what really is XAI? For a large number of people, XAI is the picture you see here on the screen. So this picture has been all over the world, husky classified as wolf because of snow. And back in the day, so 6 years ago, there were already other methods for XAI, but basically this is the one, so LIME methods, that people most knew about. And the fact is that since then, research has been quite active, and now this is XAI in 2022. So there's a large diversity of new methods, a new way to achieve XAI, new vision of XAI, new philosophies. And well, this is really a very partial view of those. It's much more diverse than that in practice. And it's great to have such a diversity, but it's also really challenging to get a common language and to get common processes on what, how to choose an XAI method and put it in the system. So when I say then XAI, I put it in singular, but there's no standalone XAI, and you can see, judging at this landscape of method, that there are many flavors of it. But that was only for the what. But if we go to the why, in the sense of asking people what are their objectives for XAI, why do they want it, why do they think it's important, depending on who you ask, you'll get very different answers and different motivations, and some may be right or wrong, but these are still the reasons that people are looking into XAI and want to have it. So judging based on this landscape of whats, this landscape of whys, in effect, there's no one size fits all XAI method. That's really our observation. And it may seem obvious, but this means that if you have different objectives, you need to apply different methods. And this one idea is really at the core of our project. So technical specification 6254 is about getting clarity on the objectives, on the method for XAI, and on how to relate one with the other. And this is basically what you can get from the scope as written here that was voted internationally. So I've said that we have been in this project for more than a year now, and so we have achieved a few things already. And what we have right now is first a survey of the XAI method that exists today. So based, of course, on the scientific survey, but refrained in a way that is more accessible to non-specialists. So you got example on the screens, and trying to put a bit of order in it. What we also have is a taxonomy of the properties that those methods can have. And by properties, we mean that based on your needs assessment and the objective that you've identified, there are concepts, technical concepts that can help you better formalizing the technical expectations on a given XAI method. And this will be very useful to identify in this wide landscape the exact type of method that's appropriate for your use case. So just I'll show briefly a few examples drawn from this taxonomy. So we've talked already about this, the question of the expertise, and depending on whether you have knowledge in AI in the domain or none of those, the explanation that will be useful for you will not be the same. And methods can produce one or the other. It's not that one is better than the other, they're just different. And this has to be accounted for. Same with the fact that when there are, it's a frequent case, different reasoning paths that can link from the same inputs to the same output, so different arguments, different way of going. In practice, there can be different explanations that are equally valid for a single processing. And this prompts the question of which one should the explainability method produce. And is it the reasoning path that the system actually used itself? Is it the reasoning path that a human put in the same position would have used? Some method do one, some method do the other. It seems that some method do neither, and maybe it could be that some do both at the same time. And last example is the concept of explicitness in the sense that if you take, for instance, feature visualization on the right, so one possible method, it produces for a neuron some kind of grapes or peacock, or we're not really sure what it shows, but it produces cues as per the functioning of the system. But this is not really an explanation that you could go to, say, a judge and saying that this is the explanation of the system and please use this as an evidence. For those, you would need a method that produce explanations that are much less subject to interpretation. But still, there are use cases where such implicit explanations is just what the users need. So, and there are other concepts that we've worked on, but please get involved in the project for looking more into those. So this is what we have already. There are also aspects that we have been struggling with for some time. In particular, we have had since last year an ongoing debate on, I don't know if I should say it's a terminological or conceptual debate, but it's prompted by the fact that there are actually two terms, explainability and interpretability. And we're not really sure whether those are the same concepts. As in there are XAI methods producing things that we can hardly call explanations, if they're just cues are their explanations. There's also the fact that different communities have been known to prefer one term on the other, and we're not sure whether that's just a terminological difference or if they indeed have different interests and focus on different concepts then for reasons well, specific to their own community. For instance, we have the terminology that policymakers are using. It's often not describing XI as the same thing that practitioners would say. And with all this well, puzzling, we are trying to define those concepts. And so we have already definitions, but maybe they're not appropriate enough for this debate that we have had with questions such as, is this concept we're talking about the ability of the human to understand or about the ability of the system to explain? And also what's the relationship with transparency? It can be sometimes not straightforward. And in this context, our practical question for the project is, which concept should we focus on and using which term? Maybe none of those, maybe another one, and we don't know yet. So that's ongoing work. And apart from that, we also have some elements still in our to-do list. And mainly three of those. The first being to landscape the objectives of the XAI stakeholders. I think we've seen that there are many different whys. We have some resources that describe all possible objectives that people have imagined, but we lack clarity on whether those are actual objectives that actual people have, or whether they are just out of our creativity as technical people, whether the technical community has imagined that users had this or that objective, but they are not those objectives in practice. Another item for work is working on the evaluation of XAI. This is clearly an open research topic, and people are really crafting new ways every day, but still, even if it's open, we still have to advise something to the industry in the meantime. We cannot leave them without any assessment need for knowing whether this is a good or bad XAI method. And we've looked into some characteristics already, but still have to ascertain whether those are really indeed always desirable and usable for evaluation, plus to derive some assessment means, metrics, or whatever. And the last item that we have to work on in the future now is to pursue the analysis of specific methods properties, in the sense that, again, there are many unknowns, but for some methods, some concept in our taxonomy, there are information that the science already has produced, and we would like to at least collect that, and that can be helpful for stakeholders to really better choose their methods and at least use what we already know, even if it's not comprehensive. So I thank you for this time and opportunity to present this work. And I think we have some question time later to talk more about that.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Florian. Another really great overview. And it's great to see towards the end on your last slide these different areas that you're currently grappling with. And those are some of the areas we'll try to look at during the workshop that we'll be organizing in January, to sort of see what AI Standards Hub community members' thinking is on those issues and how some of that thinking might support the work you're doing in the working group. Thank you very much, and thank you to all of you for your great presentations. We've got about 15 minutes left, and I'd like you all to invite you all to sort of join the virtual stage, if you wouldn't mind switching on your videos so we can move into the Q&A segment. There are a few questions coming in. I'm sure there'll be more questions coming. Maybe one question to start with, be interesting to hear anyone's reflections on those. There were two sets of questions with a couple of comments, one around definitions and then one around ethical values. So maybe we can take those together and see who would like to respond to each of those. So around definitions, I think there's a question, if I sort of try to rephrase it, around the fact that we've obviously seen in your presentations that definitions vary, including definitions between the IEEE standard and the other work that's going on in ISO IEC. We've also heard, Rania, from you, for example, that there are sort of somewhat fluid boundaries in defining the boundary between the AI system and the environment, and sort of the fact that it may be difficult to draw that line very precisely. So what is everyone's thought on, how big are these challenges in terms of where we're currently at in developing standards for those topics? Are we on track of, arriving at suitably agreed definitions? Is there a lot more work to be done? Will we ever get to sort of a, commonly agreed definition on those concepts? So that'd be one area. And then the other area around ethical values, given that, these standards form part of trustworthy AI, and ethics, of course, is an important part of trustworthy AI. I think one attendee commented on the fact that ethical values, of course, are subject to different cultural perceptions, given that these are international standards. To what extent is that an issue that you've encountered in your work? Do you perceive of the work you're doing as work that is that involves ethical value judgments? If so, how do you approach cultural differences in that context? Does anyone have any thoughts on either of those questions? Alan, maybe if you'd like to go ahead.
Thank you. So firstly, let me say, wonderful presentations. I've learned a lot, and I couldn't help reflecting, Rania, that I wished your taxonomy had been published, when we were beginning to write 7001. But on the question of definitions, and of course, essentially, you are writing a whole bunch of definitions when you're writing a standard. I think one of the things that I was really pleased with was to see actually that we've come up with, broadly very similar definitions and approaches, not just in what we mean by transparency, but also in the notion of stakeholders. So I was very encouraged by that, I have to say.
Thank you, Alan. Are there any other thoughts?
I can't find the hand.
Okay, go ahead.
So, let me. So there was this question, like on the definitions, about the political background of the definitions, and the fact that the current definition is very wide. Basically, it does not, even the international one or the ones that come around are in currency in a regulation, they don't pass the de minimis, test. Basically, your calculator will pass as AI, and it is basically given by the regulatory push. They want to have basically free hand, what to regulate. They don't want to really define AI. So I mean, the question is, maybe it's not so important to agree what AI is. I think it is important to agree that end user, consumer, citizen needs to be protected from untransparent, decisions of engineering black boxes, no matter whether they are, you know, intelligent or smart or autonomous or what other marketing label people want to stick on them, you know. And I am sort of fine with that, because what I also said, you know, regulation should not be actually targeting technology. Regulation should be protecting stakeholders from harm, no matter what technology is used to do the harm, you know. So I think that, you know, 22999 provides a possible definition of AI system. It was a very tough to get there. It's through compromise. It's not consensus. Consensus is better than compromise, you know, but this is really compromise. But I think we can work with that. Yeah, you know, like it is good enough compromise to build around. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Lauriane, would you like to come in?
Yes, the question of whether we will achieve those common definitions. Well, as I've shown the debates we've had on interpretability, explainability, and so on, and how different communities use different terms, I don't think we will ever reach a state where everybody uses the same terms for the same concepts. But in a way, it's not a problem. All we have to do is to show for our one project, okay, this is a definition of the concept that we are working on. And even if people don't use the same terminology, at least in the frame of that document, they know what to work with, and they know whether to apply or not this or that guidance element. Where we can have more trouble with is when it's related indeed with regulation. If there are terms in, say, the AI Act that do not fit neither the community terminology or the standard terminology, then yes, we have some pedagogy to put in it and explain how really those concepts relate, which is other, but this is something that we can manage, I think. Just have to put more explanations instead of trying to solve every inconsistency at the same time.
Thank you. Rania.
Thanks. Well, I just wanted to add that definitions are not set in stone. This is language. Language changes. So I think there's great value in the fact that we even sit down and discuss these things with each other, that we raise awareness that there might be confusions about definition, that we do have different perspectives and why these different perspectives exist, and that then we are able to say, but within the framework of this process, we are going to define transparency or explainability like this so that we can work with it. And maybe it's my mathematical background, but I'm totally fine with setting some axioms and then moving with it. And then, you know, in another situation, you might want to look at what happens if something else arises. And the other thing I really wanted to say is there's something really wonderful about working in international standardization, because you're talking to many different experts, and even when we disagree, we are very respectful of each other, and this is a wonderful opportunity to experience other points of view. And I think there's great value in that as well.
Thank you. And I hope, you know, your presentations and the discussion convey some of that, you know, fascinating aspect of working in international standardization fora to our audience, and sort of help spur interest in getting actively involved. David, perhaps, and then we might move on to, there's a question for Elena on the algorithmic transparency standard that I'd like to get in. But David,
sure.
Please.
Yeah, well, I wanted to elaborate a little bit on the ethics, you know, question. And you know, there was a question, how do we define it? If we don't define it, and also it's not a place of a technical committee to define ethics, you know. That's why I was very, very clear that we are not trying to define trust. We are trying to define trustworthiness. That means basically verifiable, measurable, simple scales or binary, whether a characteristic is in a system or not, and that would make the system worth of trust, but would not guarantee trust. One very important illustration is bias. Bias is not wrong. Bias is necessary. Without bias, your discriminator would not be able to tell if it's a cat or dog. So you need to manage bias, and you need to be aware that bias can have fairness impact. But basically, you cannot have systems without bias. And I think one of values, one of valuable things that our group did, we developed a bias definition that explains that bias is an engineering fact. You need to work with that. You cannot simply think bias means unfairness. It's not true. Thank you.
Thanks. I realize we're approaching the end of the scheduled time, so I might just take one brief moment acknowledging that people might have to drop off the webinar to briefly reiterate our invitation to anyone who would like to continue the conversation to apply for our workshop in January. The link again for that will be in the chat. More information can be found on our website. We'd also like to encourage you all to continue the discussion through our online forum, where you will find a discussion thread dedicated to today's event. So any questions that we weren't able to cover, please go ahead and share them there. We'll try to respond where we can. It'd be great to see community responses as well. So just to put that out there, we very much hope you found today's event interesting and will continue the journey with us on this topic. But to maybe briefly come back to one sort of closing round of questions to get in a couple of more questions. So there's a question going back to Elena, your presentation at the beginning, question about your standard, and maybe Liz, you might want to come in as well. It's sort of a similar question to the question of applicability that I asked Alan earlier. So specifically the question is, does the algorithmic transparency standard apply to party political campaigning and the use of algorithms in that context?
Sure, happy to take that. So it's important to reiterate that this policy is currently a voluntary piece of policy. So we have developed the standard over the past 1.5 years, have published it, have piloted it, have reiterated it. So right now we are relying on public sector teams who are voluntarily using the standard to provide transparency about their tools. Specifically, we've developed the standard to help teams within the public sector, so that central government and other public sector organizations, to provide this information where decisions are being concerned that impact people. So whether that can be extended to political campaigning, it's quite an interesting question. One that we haven't specifically thought about as much because it is not the civil service per se. It's something that would be very interesting to learn more about, to be honest. I'm not sure how much leverage we have to convince parties to make that information transparent. But yeah, Liz, sorry, if you want to jump in. Please do.
Thanks, Eleanor. Just very briefly, our current scope is public sector focused, so that wouldn't include political parties. As Eleanor says, we may think about expanding scope in the future, but at the moment that would not fall in scope.
Excellent. Thank you very much, both. So we've reached the end of the scheduled time. Maybe to take a moment to see if there are any final thoughts from anyone on the panel, reactions to other presentations, to the discussion we just had. I'm sure we could spend a lot more time discussing. The good news is we will have the opportunity to continue the conversation online and through the workshop. And I think, so as I mentioned before, the workshop will be focused on the 2 standards under development in ISO IEC. And we've heard some of the questions that are currently the focus of those ongoing discussions in the working group. So we'll look at those more closely. Also, without doubt, we'll consider sort of the relationship between the 2 standards and the concept of transparency on the one hand and explainability on the other. if there are no concluding thoughts from anyone, I might just take the opportunity to sort of close the webinar at that point. Thank you very much to all of you. It's really been, a fantastic set of presentations. We're really delighted to have had the chance, and it's really a unique chance to hear from all of you in one event, and then, from you in particular, given your close relationship to this work, and to hear so directly from people leading the development of these standards. So I hope, to those of you listening and watching, this has been interesting. We hope to see you again soon at one of our forthcoming events. And to you all as speakers, a big thank you for joining us today. And hopefully see you soon. Take care.